thanks so much for talking to me, Angie. And I want to talk to you specifically about research because your books strike me as really being steeped in research and both and also about a variety of different topics. And so there's sort of two things I think of when I think of research, which is one, the kind of research I would do in a library, and two, the kind of thing you would do, which is sort of what I end up doing more of. But what I'm trying to do more of personally is, research outside of the library. And you seem to do a whole lot of both. And so I was wondering if you could maybe just start with maybe just talking a little bit about the specific research you did for probably your most well-known book, which is The Bone Cage. So I just wonder if you could maybe just dive into that and we'll kind of just move through topics from there. But what were you actually doing for research for that book?
First, I just want to say that I love that you say that my books seem like they're steeped in research,
Yeah.
because my background before I ever wrote fiction was as an academic, and I was a medievalist where book research was so important. But after a while, I wanted to write things that I always say I wanted my parents to be able to pick up my book and read it and understand and get why I'd done it, which wasn't always the case when I was writing academic articles about medieval poetry. And I thought, if I'm going to spend all this time working on writing, I want people in my life who aren't necessarily academics to get what I do and why I do it. So I love writing novels that more people will read. But I do admire that kind of rigor and that sort of research, and I'm never sure if it's appearing in my books. I really appreciate that you think that I do lots of research, and I do. But like you say, it's not always book research for fiction, and I enjoy that mix of the library time and the book time, but then also being able to go out and talk to people and experience new things and incorporate that in my books. And with The Bone Cage, it was so important for me to get the physical detail of those athletic worlds, right? And I was able to do, which I can do a lot when I write fiction, able to draw on my own experience. So swimming, I've never swum at the Olympics, but I swam my whole life. I was on competitive swim teams from the time I was 4 until I was into my 30s. So I've spent a lot of time looking at the pool bottom, as my character Sadie does. So I could incorporate that into my writing, all of that physical detail and physical knowledge. With the wrestling, I have never wrestled, but my brother wrestled in the 2000 Olympic Games, and my father before him wrestled. I grew up watching my father wrestle. My first husband wrestled. Because The Bone Cage is about swimming and wrestling, and my first husband was a wrestler. My second husband was a swimmer. I like to say I don't do research, I just get married, which my husband doesn't like that joke at all. But in reality, as you can imagine, I might have watched wrestling my whole life, but in The Bone Cage, when we get to Digger, the book alternates between the swimmer Sadie and the Digger wrestler called Digger. And when I get to Digger, I don't want the reader to feel like they're witnessing wrestling from the outside, which is the only way I know wrestling. I want the reader to feel like they're in the skin of the wrestler. And Suzette Mayer, my first reader, my dissertation advisor, as she was involved in your project too, she was the one that made me see that. She said, when I'm reading Sadie, I feel like I am an Olympic swimmer. When I watch Digger, I feel like I'm watching from the stand. So then at that late stage, that's when I had to bring in a whole new kind of research. So I interviewed countless wrestlers. What does it feel like what do your quads feel like at the start of the match when you're fresh? What do they feel like at the end? What about your hamstrings? What about your hands? What about your wrists? What about when you're losing? What about when you're winning? And the wrestlers I know are very, very intelligent and articulate. So the thing, and this is their world, they know it. So the phrases they would say, it was almost like ready-made poetry. It was so exact and perfect. So that was fun to then take that and infuse it all in throughout the novel and bring it to a new level.
So is that something you were doing in the editing process more fully then? Because you say you were kind of digging after a specific physical, this is how this feels. This is, how I mentally feel when I do this. How much do you kind of do maybe before that editing stage? And how much do you think you're kind of doing in that editing, revising stage in terms of, searching for particular types of research?
For me, writing is such a layering thing, and I always feel like my process is very inefficient and like I should come up with a different process. But, I'm 4 books in, and I guess it works, and I guess I have to at some page, okay, this is the way I do it. And I think of it like, to make myself feel better, make sense of it, I think of it like as if a painter would put one layer on, stand back and see how it looks, then go closer and put some more layers and then maybe erase this. And so I'm kind of always going back to the same page and layering and taking things out and putting things back in. And research works the same way for me. So with that wrestling example, the book had already been accepted. It was accepted by New West Press, and I felt like it was in pretty good shape, and I was totally stoked to have my first book coming out. And then I got this feedback from Suzette, which was brilliant and dead on the mark, but made me kind of want to cry. I thought, oh my God, that's That's a lot of work. That's a massive rewrite. And then I went right back to the interview stage, which you would imagine coming first, but it wasn't. I hadn't seen that last until Suzette pointed it out, and then it was absolutely there. So that researching came late, and I think that layering sort of process is at work in my other books too. Like I wrote Between is my most recent novel, and it features one of the narrators is a Filipino nanny who leaves her family in the Philippines, goes to Hong Kong in order to make her way to Canada, where she figures the streets will be paved with gold because that's what she's been told. And I've never been a Filipino nanny. I've never lived in the Philippines. I've never lived in Hong Kong. I've never taken care of other people's children. I've never lived in other people's basements. I've none of that stuff. And so that, again, was a lot of that same kind of research, talking to people and getting those details, which I had not seen portrayed in fiction. But I can't assume that I'm going to get all the research done and then start the book. I don't know what I don't know until I'm writing. And I don't know where it's falling flat or too thin until I have a full draft. And I don't know, there'll be other holes that I don't see until a really good editor points them out to me. So I'm constantly going back to the research. It's not, I mean, it would be easy if it was research, outline, rough draft, revise, publish. That's not how my process works. So it's always a big mix of it all.
So if you're always going back in revisions or even when you're drafting to, the research and trying to find things, how do you balance researching and writing? Like, how do you do, because research can be a trap, that keeps you from writing, I think.
Yeah. I was one time at a festival and I won't name any names, but there was a very established, successful Canadian fiction writer speaking, and she had written a book about the writing community in the 70s, I think it was, and someone in the audience who was a very established, older nonfiction writer who had grown up through that age, she asked her about research. Like, so how did you go about researching the writing scene in Canada in the 70s? And the novelist sort of blew the question off a little bit. She said, I don't like to get too bogged down in research. I just kind of skimmed along, and I could just see the eye rolling in from the nonfiction, heavy-duty, successful researcher who lived in that era, right? Who had been a writer in those movements. And I could see both of their side. Like, as a novelist, I mean, you can totally get trapped in research if you feel like you need to know everything before you start writing, because you will never know everything, and you won't even know what you don't know until you're writing. But on the other hand, I could see someone who's lived in this time and say, well, what do you know? And now you're blowing off research. So I think the answer is in the middle. Like, you sure don't want to get caught out not knowing your stuff, but you don't want to get stuck researching forever. For me, that's why it's that layering. Like, I let myself start writing with that constant awareness of that, okay, I don't know what it's like to be an Olympic wrestler. I don't know what it's like to be a Filipino nanny. And my early drafts are filled with square brackets, come back, find more about this, find out what do they eat, what do they do on their day off, what do they, and what is the, climate like this time of year? And so many questions come up, but I don't know what I'm going to need to know. So my first drafts are just a mess of square brackets. And then I come back and fill those in with research. And I find, there's so much you can do on the internet now. There's so much information, but I find talking to the source, to the people, is so much more helpful. Like, those details, those physical, visceral, exact details that those Olympic wrestlers gave me, I could have never got those no matter what I Googled or no matter what library I read in. And same with the Filipino stuff. I read everything I could get my hands on about the Philippines. But sitting down with these Filipino nannies living in Canada and asking them, and they're just so excited to share the details of their life, and they would tell me things I wouldn't think to ask, or stories would come out because it would be a good story they want to share with me, and that I would have never got there by doing book research.
So how much?
But it's kind of like, I was going to say I like the balance because one thing when I was in academia and that writing, research about something so specific and esoteric that most people don't care about, I found hard. I think I'm an extrovert by nature, so even though I'm drawn to writing, it's a very antisocial profession, and so I love the mix of, like, when I get right into a project and I'm writing, but then I can say, I wonder what someone who's similar to this character would have to say, and I can go and I can talk to people about what I'm working on, and I can have those exchanges. I like the antisocial balance instead of just immersing myself in written words.
So how do you go about approaching somebody that you want to talk to about, to interview for some reason or other? Like, what's a good way to approach a person? And have you had any resistance from people about broaching particular topics, or how do you kind of negotiate or handle, when you're discussing something with somebody that they know and you're going to put in a book, like in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you're not, putting them in a book, but I think for a lot of people, especially when you're trying to get at personal details about, how this feels, how that felt, what's this experience like? Like, I wonder, it seems like it could be a tricky sort of thing to negotiate. I'm just curious to know how you handle that.
Yeah, I think I tend to be really enthusiastic about a project when I'm immersed in it, like most people are. Why would you write a book if you weren't enthusiastic? So I
Mm-hmm.
think I come to them with that enthusiasm and excitement to know their story and share their story. And like in the case of the Olympic wrestlers, or in the case of the Filipino nannies, those are people I hadn't seen represented in fiction yet and Canadian literature, and that's why I felt compelled to tell their story. And so they're also responding to that absence. That they're like, well, hey, yeah, our story hasn't been told, or where is the book about my story? So they on one hand, they've seemed to feel honored that I think their stories worth telling, and enthusiastic to share their details and their stories and all those little things that I wouldn't know. And so I've been greeted with real enthusiasm and generosity. People are very happy to talk to me as much as I want. Now, whether or not they're happy with the book once it comes out, because it's then my version of their story, I think sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes people have shared their story and their information, and then somehow it's not what they expected, and that's where the awkward part comes in. And I find that disappointing too. If someone, like, for example, to be more specific, my novel, The Canterbury Trail, is partly about ski culture in a town very much like Fernie, where I live, but it's fictionalized. And so I talked a lot when I was writing the project. I'm not one of these people who say, I'm not going to say anything till it's done. I love to talk about what I'm doing. I'm a talker. So I would tell people, I'm writing a story about Fernie, and it's going to be funny, and it's going to be this and that. And so a lot of people would say, oh, you should write about this or that. And they tell me stories, and some of those made their way in. But when it came out, it's pretty darkly satirical, and it didn't occur to me that people might not like to have their town satirized. So the enthusiasm that while I was working on it didn't in all cases match the enthusiasm once it was out, and that's hard to take. But I don't know. I've decided I'm going to be a writer, and I can't write and worry about what people are going to think. If I sat down and thought, oh, is so and so going to like this, and what about so and so? Are they going to be mad? And what would this be? This make this person happy? I wouldn't write a word, right? So at some point, I just have to be. It's my vision and it's my story, and if someone wants to tell their vision and their story, they're welcome, and hopefully I don't offend too many people. But if that was my main goal, not to offend people, then I would write Hallmark cards, not novels.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And of course, you're approaching the person saying, I'm going to put it in a book. It's not necessarily a surprise, although, like you say, they might just not understand the process as well. But it's interesting. It's nice to hear that people are generally enthusiastic and about your enthusiasm, I guess, which I suppose, as you point out, must make a big difference. I just want to, speaking of the Canterbury Trail, one of the things that strikes me with that book too is, in addition to being about ski culture, and as you're going talking to people and getting their stories and all these personal experiences, and sort of dragging the whole wealth of kind of real world experience in there. There's also, of course, a level at which is has this wellspring. It's coming kind of from the wellspring of Chaucer, and as you say, your academic sort of training is more firmly in that base camp. One thing I always find interesting about that is I often will see reviews where nobody will notice or seem to understand that it's even just in the title, like a reference to one of the most famous literary works of all time. So you're doing a lot of clear literary research as well, for a book like that, and so maybe you can talk a bit more about that specific book and the kind of research you might do in a library, or even just if there was a book you were writing where maybe you had to do a lot of that kind of really heavily kind of literary focused research. Like, how would you approach that? Is there ways you approach it differently, or and again,
Yeah.
how do you kind of, like, for that book specifically, like, how did you kind of balance those two worlds of research, if that makes sense?
Yep, it does make sense. The bone cage also is a medieval reference. It's from
Yeah.
Beowulf. The bone cage is a metaphor for the body. And so when I have a friend who teaches at MacEwan University in Edmonton, and he and I had been at Western together in my medievalist days, and he said, you're still a medievalist. You might pretend you're writing about swimming and wrestling and skiing, but you're at heart, you're a medievalist. So I always tell my students that when you decide to write, whether it's a poem or a book or anything, you're entering into a conversation, and this conversation has been going on since the start of the written word. So if you think you don't have to listen to what everyone else is saying before you decide what you have to say, then that's an incredibly egotistical, narcissistic act, right? You can't, it's a conversation. You have to have some idea what everyone else is saying before you enter into it. And so reading is so important. And I mean, maybe not everybody needs to go back to the classics and the medieval literature. And that was my training. So when I enter into a conversation, it's not just with other Canadian writers or other contemporary writers, but it's sometimes with this medieval stuff that I spent years and years reading and thinking about. So with the Canterbury Trail, I really like the idea that in Chaucer, he has these pilgrims, and they're on a pilgrimage, and they're people who wouldn't normally spend time together. So because of this pilgrimage, it brings people together from all different classes and all different walks of life, and people that might not talk to each other in everyday existence, and they're together for this space, and so we see them interact, and so it allows him the opportunity to do a satire of a cross section of his society. And I thought, isn't that perfect with the world I lived in, Fernie? Our pilgrimage in Chaucer, it's the spring showers, April showers bring them out for the pilgrimage. But in my story, it starts puking out, as we say. It's snowing very heavily, and the ski hill is already closed down. So all these different people get the idea that they're going to go into the backcountry and spend the last winter weekend having their snow fun. And so it's the spring snow showers that bring them out. And it's a similar, I use the types, the cross section, the rednecks, the hippies, the developers, the urbanites, and I just get a cross section. So that wouldn't work in every, like someone said to me once, oh, Moose Jaw's where you're from. Why didn't you try to do this with Moose Jaw? And it just wouldn't work. Like Fernie has those types that, Chaucer had a different set of types. And the same kind of thing, that they might not share worldviews, but put them together. And so from the start, I was playing off of Chaucer, and in some ways I didn't have to do a ton of research because I'd already done it in my life. I did my medieval comps on Chaucer. I taught Chaucer courses. I memorized Chaucer. So it was there, but I did go back, and I would every time similar. Like I didn't feel like I had to sit down and memorize Chaucer's Canterbury Tales before I started. But when I came to a section in the book, I thought, I wonder how this could play off the Miller's Tale, or I wonder how this could play off that structurally, or what if I somehow used Chaucer's retraction in the end to inform my ending, and I would go back as needed. So that same kind of layering process I talked about, like I can't feel like I need to hold everything in my head before I even start. So always with the layering. But like you said, I was shocked when the reviews started coming out, and there was this one review in the Globe and Mail. I swear the guy had never even heard of the Canterbury Tales. He started out by criticizing that I had used types like the redneck and the hippie and the ski bum. Yeah. And I was like, that's the whole point. So you can't assume, as a writer, you do all this research and you can't assume that the reader is there with you. Like,
I think you can normally...
A famous text like the Canterbury Tales is going to be lost on some people.
Well,
some people are reading in the Globe and Mail.
You would hope it wouldn't be lost on a reviewer of books, but I don't know. Maybe it was cut. You know how newspapers are, but it is an odd thing for that specific book, just because of the title. Like even if you're going to miss, all these allusions or what have you, it's the friggin' title. Like I just found it strange, but it says something I think about reviewing culture in a general sense, but. It is, though, on the other hand, in some ways, arguably a kind of testament to, sneaking the research in an unobtrusive way. And I'm wondering if that's something you're concerned about, because I know that's a concern of a lot of writers. They do all this research, and then they kind of take the iceberg tip of the research, and they put it in, and they try to be very careful not to make it obtrusive in some ways, and to kind of really pick and choose what they put in. So one, I'm kind of wondering if you do that, but two, I'm just sort of curious about that process of like how do you figure out what to put in and what not to put in, because of course you're not writing a nonfiction tome. As you say, it is a novel, and so you just have this limit to the amount of research you need, and of course you could always put more than you need if you choose. It's not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but I'm curious to know what your approach is and how you kind of make those distinctions. Like how do you tell what needs to be in there versus maybe what you might just put in there for, the reader that cares, but doesn't necessarily need to be there, versus like what do you really hold back for some reason or other?
I can answer that question with an example too with the Canterbury Trails. Is I also, as I was working on the book, I thought I'm talking a lot about our relationship with the environment and about ecotourism and about outdoor recreation, snowmobiling versus backcountry skiing and what that says about how we feel about our environment. And also these people who incredibly want to take that backcountry space and it's theirs and they get to say what it's going to be and they get to name it and they all fighting over ownership of this unownable wild. And so I thought, this is obviously engaged with the same kind of ideas as eco-criticism, a branch of literary theory. And I didn't know very much about eco-criticism other than what anyone can figure out is about environment and about literature. And so, but as I was working on the book, I thought, I need to know more about eco-criticism because I'm obviously dealing with the same issues. So I started reading all the standard texts and learning as much as I could, knowing full well that I'm not going to just take that theory and plunk it in the middle of my novel. But at the same time, like I said, I'm entering into a conversation. I need to know what other people are saying about this. And so I mean, it's informed by eco-criticism, not whether most people would know that or not, I don't know. But I took some lines that I really liked, like the map is not the train, for example. And so I have someone in the novel, I have other ways I'm gesturing toward this branch of thinking, but someone actually says the map is not the train in my novel. And I maybe have a few other little signals like that. And I feel like I said, in my mind, I'm doing the research so that I can be part of the conversation. I'm not writing in a vacuum. I'm not egotistical enough to think nobody else has ever talked about environment and literature. So I better see what they say and where I'm fitting in that conversation. So that's a whole bunch of research I do so that I feel confident that I'm entering into a conversation rather than talking to myself. Are all readers going to pick up on that? No, but in fact, I was really surprised. No reviewers for the longest time mentioned the environmental aspect of the Canterbury Trail. And I was kind of like, oh, that just was lost on everybody. And then all of a sudden, this guy, Corey Willard, reviewed it for the sport literature blog in the US. And he did a complete eco-criticism reading of it. And I just felt like, woohoo, it really is there. It's there if people want to find it. It's not going to be there for every reader. And then since then, a couple profs have taught. Richard Pickard at U of Vic taught it in his eco-criticism course. So it gets there. It's there, and I think as a writer of novels, if you're writing academic stuff, you're writing for experts, and you can expect them to get so focused, right? When I write a novel, I realize people are going to read it in different ways and get different things out of it, and so maybe nobody will get that my book is about our relationship with the environment, except for the people who are looking for that. So how do I know what to leave in? Because they're right. The map is not the train. It's a little tip. And what else, the whole conversation that's ready to be drawn out for readers who want to is underneath. How do I was talking about this because that's part of the revision process, right? I might have way too much and I might have a big chunk of really heavy-handed eco-critical jargon in the middle of my novel, which is not going to work. Or I might be hinting towards something that's too subtle of a hint and nobody's going to pick it up. So where to find the space between that is something that happens at the revision process. And I was talking to one of my students about this the other day, that it's on I don't know if you know Link, Malcolm Gladwell's book. He talks about how we have all these people, I'm going to give you an example because otherwise I'm not going to do justice. But he said, say you have someone who is an expert at telling whether a painting is a fraud or an original. And that person might come and look and say, oh, it's a fraud, or oh, it's an original. And they know right away. And it's not how they know, is they just have all this detailed information in their head that their brain is processing so fast that you can't even tell that it's actually working through this list of things that they know. And I think by reading a lot and be noting what works, what doesn't work, what do I respond to, what do I think is brilliant, what do I just chuck and not remember and can't even stand to read it. In my brain, I have a list of all those things, that what works and what doesn't. But as Malcolm Gladwell said, the response, my brain processes that and I get some kind of physical response. So when I read something that's really good, my skin buzzes with excitement. I'm like, this is good. When I read something that's not good, I kind of feel like an embarrassment response, especially if I'm the one who's written it. So I use that physical response. When I've written something, I can put it aside. And when I come back to read my own, I can hear those physical, oh, my skin's buzzy and I like this part. This is actually better than I thought. Or, oh, this is embarrassing, right? And so then I can kind of guess what to tease out and what to cut. Not to say that I always get it right, but that's how I decide how much of the iceberg to show.
Do you think that the research helps open it up to multiple audiences? Like, one of the things that struck me when you were talking about how this person noticed this person noticed that. Is I wonder if that opportunity would be there if you didn't have all that research. So if you have all the research that maybe nobody in Canadian book reviews is going to notice, but there's some medievalist who's noticing it. Like, do you feel like that's something that really helps, I guess you'd say, build an audience for the work, or do you think that's I guess, like, outside of the story itself, which of course has this attraction, do you think like there's a level at which the research widens kind of the scope of who might want or enjoy this book? Does that make sense?
I do think so, and I think I'm very grateful people teach my books. My books get
Yeah.
taught in universities in Canada and the U.S., especially the Bone Cage, but the Canterbury Trail as well. And so I'm so grateful for that because it gives the book a life beyond that little 6 to 8 month window that seems to be the publishing cycle. And so I try to write books that are compelling and a good story, and people who aren't looking for Chaucer, aren't looking for criticism, or aren't looking for Beowulf, they can read it on that level and they can enjoy it and they can like the characters and they can talk about it afterwards. And then they can move on to the next thing and forget about it. But because I'm a English teacher by training, that's just what I am, I think about books, about how could you teach them and what would you talk about and what might someone write an essay about. And so on one hand, I think, oh, I wish I could just write a popular book, that grocery aisle store book that everybody would read, and then someone would make a Hollywood movie. But I have to say, no, this is the kind of reader I am, and so this is going to be the kind of writer I am. And the upside is I reach these different audiences, and people do teach my books, and people write my books, and that's very gratifying that people are spending that much time. And so, and it gives the book a life beyond that 8 month cycle because it's so short the publishing.
One thing I often tell students, when they kind of are pushing against research, is that even those guys and girls who are like writing the huge mass market, commercial fiction, like they're often doing crazy amounts of research. So if you look at that, Da Vinci Code, I mean, that is a meticulously researched book, although, you could argue with some of the research. And of course, it's a horribly written book. But, it's just a bunch of research. And a lot of the attraction to that book is, in fact, the amount of research that went into it, I mean, most of them work on a different model than he does because they're publishing constantly. But, I feel like the research, which is what is hard. And a lot of people want to find excuses not to do it because of the difficulty. Or they feel like they're in some story or some topic where maybe they don't know what they would research. And they're writing about, often people who are writing fantasy of some sort will try to sort of skimp on the research. And I try to point out to them, no, like, you still have to do some research. Like, maybe you don't, need to do the kind of research that somebody else might do, but you still got to go read books in that genre. You got to read similar types of work. One of the big things I do for research is just find other books that are like my idea, because they're of course out there, and there's always that danger, I think, of not knowing, as you say, not knowing the conversation that has been happening that you're now stepping into, and all of a sudden now you're saying all these stupid things because you just don't get that, like, that was said 200 years ago and it was said better. And it's in fact that's a score that's been settled, or what have you. So kind of coming off that, I'm wondering, like, have you always sort of had this approach to research? Like, if you go back to your short story book, Anything Boys Can Do, I mean, that's a variety of stories, but so it's not really like one thing that you're researching necessarily, but was there a way that you were kind of doing some of this sort of approach to research, with those stories, or when you were kind of putting the book as a whole together, was there a way in which you were maybe like looking at other short story books or other models? Like, how did maybe the research look for that book versus, say, some of the novels that you've written since then?
Before I'm going to answer that, but first I just want to back to one of the earlier things you said about writing in different genres. And I think the other thing that kind of research does, but by saying, okay, I'm going to write a fantasy novel, I better go read the best fantasy novels and the contemporary fantasy novels. And one thing that does is just lets you know how high the bar is set. No matter what field you pick to write in, there's really good stuff out there. And so recently I thought my current novel was taking the direction of horror fiction, thriller sort of. Mm-hmm. And I went and I read Andrew Piper, who's tremendously successful in Canada, scary man. And then I read Craig Davidson, who writes under Nick Cutter.
Yeah.
And God, they're good. Those books are good. So anyone who has the idea that by maybe doing genre fiction it might be less competitive or the writing has to be less solid is out to lunch. Those books are good, and so it just gives you a reality check of where the bar is
It's more
set.
competitive, and it's even more competitive in the simple marketplace terms. One thing I always say to people, if they, if they're thinking, oh, I should maybe start writing genre fiction, it might be easier. I say, yeah, it's harder because, there's more people doing it. The standards are, pretty high. Like, people often poo-poo some of the popular or commercial fiction, but like, they have heavy standards. They get back to you faster with faster rejections, and they are very. I mean, it's not always publishing great stuff, but like everywhere else. But it's not an easy task. I'm really impressed with Nick Cutter in particular because he's putting out book after book, and I don't know how he does it.
The Truth is the scariest, grossest, most disturbing book I've ever
Yeah.
read in my life. And I spent my teenage years obsessed with Stephen King, so I had
Yeah.
had my time in that genre. But God, that's a book. It's really
Yeah.
good.
I liked it a lot. There's a couple of things I didn't like about it, but generally speaking, I was pretty impressed. And the book, The Deep, I thought was even better. Although again, you can always pick a few things that may be problematic, but he's quite impressive, and Piper as well. Again, has done some really impressive stuff, and there's just so
And
many people.
one of his books is a response to Paradise Lost, and one is a
Yeah,
response to Dawn. So he has that kind of research that you're talking about too.
yeah,
And I said, what comes next? Because he's always figuring the book about evil or the book about dark, scary things, and how he's in conversation with it. Like, I like to talk. And he said, well, when you're talking scary, he said, you can't get much scarier than the Bible, any of the
yeah,
Bibles. So I think maybe that's what we'll see come next. Now, just to bring it back to the Anything Boys Can Do question you asked about my short story collection, part of me is tempted to say, oh no, I didn't research that, which would be a lie. Because what it was my teach myself to write book. I had been doing academia, and in my secret mind, I always wanted to be a fiction writer, but was too chicken to give it a try. And then in 1999, April 9th, I got in a head-on collision on the highway, and I thought I was going to die. As you can see, I didn't die. So when I woke up in the Foothills Trauma Ward with a broken back, not knowing if I'd ever walk again, as soon as I recovered, I started, okay, no, you know what? I want to be a fiction writer. I'm going to figure out how this is done. So I bought every kind of how do you write fiction book that there is. And as I was doing those exercises, I was shaping them all towards short stories. I'm very, very goal oriented, I guess. So even while I was just doing practice writing, I was like, okay, well, if I can work these up into 10 or 12 short stories and then put them in a book, that could be my first book, right? So part of the research was just how do you write a short story? How do you write characters? How do you write dialogue? How do people even do this? And then at the same time, I was subscribing to every literary magazine I could get my hands, the Grains, the Mellhat Reviews, the Event, the New Quarterly, and just reading what is getting published and which ones do I like and what don't I like and why. And so that it was more of a research of form and genre and marketplace and craft than other research. And so I was writing about things around me like infidelity and betrayal and communication between the sexes and things just very much the world around me, but figuring out how to write. And so sometimes I say that that's the book that other writers have left in their drawer. People talk about their first book being in their drawer and will never see the light of day. And for me, that is me with my broken back in my basement suite, teaching myself how to write short stories. That's the product of that in that book. So I did a ton of research, right? But it was research different from my other books, research on how to write.
but that's a significant amount of research, and I think it's something that, again, like a lot of people discount. Like, at least sometimes when you're talking to people, they seem to discount that, and they have this idea that they don't want an influence, or they don't want they don't need to know what is going on. It can somehow be a hindrance. Of course, it's not, but it's hard to sometimes explain that. And you do have to kind of learn even who you are as a writer, I think, which it kind of takes a weird sort of research to do that, because again, you don't necessarily know what the options are, in a manner of speaking, if you don't, again, even just kind of read widely. One thing that, though, I think becomes a trap eventually is people start to figure out who they think they are as a writer, and then they have this narrow focus, and so of course, again, research, I mean, can often kind of just break you out of that. I mean, and one of the things that impressed me about you is you're often tackling very different material. So coming to Between, your more recent book again, if we just kind of cycle back to that again, maybe could you talk a bit about the genesis of that book and again, kind of how you started pursuing the idea? Just to kind of get a clearer picture of the amount of research or the type of work you would do before you really started drafting, because a lot of what we've been talking about so far is, in the revision process or while drafting. But before you started working on that book, what were you kind of thinking, and what kind of drew you to that book, and what did you kind of do before you really started going with it?
So I agree. My books are really different from each other, and which is funny because they all come in some way from my life. They're not that I don't write autobiographical fiction per se, but they come out of obsessions or preoccupations or things that I need to figure out for my own personal reasons. So my life just changes enough every 5 years or so that I can have a book that seems very different from my obsessions of the last 5 years. So with Between, I had kids quite late in life. I was almost 40 when my second was born, second and last. And so I already had an established career, and I had goals, and I don't know what I thought these children were going to be, little accessories that would just add to my already perfect life. And it turns out that having kids, as you know, is incredibly transformative. And I was I was madly in love with my children, and so grateful to have healthy children. I was figure out the work-life balance and how I was supposed to keep on with the things I'd been doing, or am I just supposed to slam my brakes on my career? So I was struggling with all these things about being a working mother, and at the same time, I had issues with people were starting to get Filipino nannies in the community I lived in, and I thought I had liberal guilt issues around that. Like, what right do I have to take advantage of someone so impoverished and transplant them to make my first world life even easier? And so I was really struggling with that, and things got to a breaking point where we did need live-in help, and we did have a woman from the Philippines come live with us for 2 years. And it just seemed so conflicted and complex, and I needed to put pen to paper to even figure it out. And so that's where that novel idea came from. And this is something I'm just figuring out about my process. I don't really outline, and I wish I could. I don't really know exactly the ending when I start. I know ideas of, I know what I'm writing about, and it's a real struggle. And I think I figured out that I almost write a garbage draft first, and that's my outline. Like, I just start writing, and I don't know another way to do it. But I think at some point I just have to accept, well, this is my process, and a book comes at the end, so why fight it? Why not? So I think I put pen to paper and just write a draft almost that isn't even, like, you would never want someone to read it. It would be horribly embarrassing. And that's when then I stand back from that and figure out what it's about. So I had done a draft of this one almost all from the working mother who's having a breakdown first point of view, and it was incredibly navel gazing and narcissistic and narrow. And I think when I stood back and I started thinking about how it's going to work, I thought, no, this needs to be back and forth between the two women, between the working North American mother who's totally overextended and at a breaking point and not coping, with the Filipino woman who's leaving her family behind to try to survive, and the relationship between them. And so I had to research so much to fill that in, and now I can't even remember what your question was because I got lost.
No, you've answered my question. It was just sort of about, again, how you kind of led yourself to that idea and what research you were doing before you started drafting. And so the other sort of question related to that, I suppose, is it possible to do too much research? Like, is it possible to paralyze yourself, or to otherwise, again, just sort of break away from writing into this, research mode, and kill the idea? Have you ever had that happen, or how do you avoid that happening?
It's very important for me to put pen to paper early on, even if I'm writing stuff that's not going to end up being in a final draft, because if I think I need to, because I write to find out the answers. I write to figure out what the problem is and then what the answers are. So I don't, if I had all the answers before I started, or if I had totally understood something before I started, I wouldn't feel the need to write, for one thing. And yeah, I prefer a serious process. I did a Saskatchewan Writers Guild conference in March. And the speakers were Christian Book and Michael Helm, and I was struggling with this manuscript, and And I was talking to people like Andrew Piper and Terry Fallis who outline, and I was thinking, I need to outline. Like, they know what the story is and whether the story is going to work, and they make an outline. I was like, I'm doing it wrong. I need to do it like these guys do it. And it wasn't coming to life for me. And I was trying to do it in a different way based on those guys. And then Michael Helm, he talked about writing into the dark and not really knowing what you're doing, and how amazing the creative process is, that you access this part of your brain that you didn't even know existed and you can never access otherwise. And I felt myself light up, that physical visceral response that I talked about that you need to listen to. I thought, I miss. And that's the kind of writing I do, and that is my process. And maybe sometimes it's frightening and frustrating and seems like not very efficient to my scientist husband or something, but that's the way I do it. I just dive in and write right into the dark, as Michael Helm says. But then research as needed and fill in the holes and figure out what the story is. And it's an incredibly messy process, but creativity is messy. I think I have a psychiatrist friend in Massachusetts who's also a writer, and he talks both about life and in writing, and have to tolerate chaos. That's what leads to creation. So when there's a certain amount of disorder and chaos, and that's what creation grows out of. So I at least need to have a tolerance for that messy, disordered, chaotic part of the process, and trust that something's going to grow out of it. I tell myself, I'm 4 books in, I should trust my process at this point.
Well, excellent. Well, I think that's a good note to kind of end off on. So I just want to thank you very much for talking to me, and it's been great. And yeah, get back to work. I mean, you came from the library this morning, right? Were you there researching something, or were you?
Actually, no, I'm on the library board. So
there you go. Well, you could always, double dip and write a book about a library board. At least, maybe not. but no, that's excellent. Well, thanks so much, Angie.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.